Hello and welcome. We'll get started in just a moment. Good evening and welcome. From the Boston Public Library, I'm Kristen Motti, an adult programs librarian. Joining the BPL tonight as partners, we have the State Library of Massachusetts and American Ancestors, the New England Historic Genealogical Society, both our neighbors here in Boston. Beth Carroll Horrocks from the State Library of Massachusetts will join us in just a moment to welcome you and to introduce our guest moderator, S.C. Gwynn. And to welcome on behalf of American Ancestors, I'd just like to mention that Margaret Talcott couldn't be with us this evening, but she will join us next week for the next upcoming program. Before we meet Dorothy and Sam, just a few items of housekeeping. In this Zoom webinar space, your cameras and microphones are muted. We do want to hear from you though, so your questions can be typed into the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. You'll see links shared out through the chat during the program via the chat, including where you can buy copies of tonight's featured book. Closed captioning is also available, and you can either turn it on or off via the little CC button on the bottom of your screen that says live transcript. Copies of tonight's featured book, The Agitators, Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights, can be bought from our bookstore partner for this evening, Trident Booksellers. They can also be shipped, copies can be shipped nationwide for free using the special code on the screen and also in the chat. Or you can check your local library for copies there. Now from the State Library of Massachusetts, Beth Carroll Horrocks. Beth, welcome.
Thank you, Kristen, and hello, everyone. Just a quick hello from the State Library of Massachusetts. I'm Beth Carroll Horrocks, the head of special collections there. We continue to believe that one of the good things about this pandemic is that we've been able to expand our public programming through collaboration with other institutions, such as our partners tonight, the Boston Public Library and American Ancestors, NEHGS. We're very glad to be here tonight for this virtual discussion of Dorothy Wickenden's new work, since the topic fits in so well with our own library holdings. So Dorothy will be in conversation tonight with S.C. Sam Gwynn, Pulitzer Prize finalist and New York Times bestselling author of, among many other works, Empire of the Summer Moon, Rebel Yell, The Violence, Passion, and Redemption of Stonewall Jackson, and Hymns of the Republic. And these are all works in American history. He's also written for numerous newspapers and other publications, and we've put a link to his website in the chat so that you can read all about his work. And we will hear more from Sam shortly. We're all going to learn a lot tonight, I'm convinced, and from the perfect author to inspire us all. So Dorothy, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. It is really great to be here. Especially with Sam, whose work I've been reading for a very long time and admire. He's done a lot on the Civil War, as you mentioned. So we're just going to have a conversation about my book and whatever he's curious about asking me. And I guess we will be hearing from the audience as well. We always welcome questions from readers or would-be readers and people who are interested in the period.
Okay. Hello out there in library land. Dorothy's written a wonderful book about three extraordinary women, Harriet Tubman, Martha Wright, and Frances Seward. She's also written a book about the intersection of two of the most powerful forces in American history, the women's movement for equal women's rights and the anti-slavery movement. But before we get going though, Dorothy, I have to ask you a geography question, because a lot of the action that takes place in your book takes place in this obscure little part of upstate New York, Finger Lakes region, in towns like Auburn and Waterloo and Seneca Falls, and that most people have never heard of. And not only that, but coming through these places that no one has heard of is this astounding collection of the who's who of all these movements. You have Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. And I mean, it keeps going, you know, Marianne McClintock and Lucretia Mott. I can just keep going. But anyway, the point is, why there? And a secondary question, was that the Berkeley of the 1840s?
Actually, I never thought about it as the Berkeley of the 1840s. Not exactly. And it is such a fascinating region. I knew about it because my grandmother happened to grow up in Auburn, New York. And so I had heard her stories about it. And that indirectly was what led to my previous book and this book. It is true that before, I would say 1848, no one knew anything about that part of the state. With the Seneca Falls Convention, not very far from Auburn, the country suddenly did learn about it. Until that point, Seneca Falls was this tiny little village full of farmers that was known for its wheelbarrow making. So that changed with Seneca Falls. But really, you're totally right. In the 20th century, unless you've gone to school in the region, as I did. I went to college at Hobart and William Smith colleges, which is in Geneva, not very far from there, and in the heart of that country. Most people I talked to when I was beginning this book said, wait, what? The Finger Lakes? Where are they? And it's a totally beautiful part of the state. It's also interesting because this region was this hotbed of all of these major movements eventually. But it was also extremely conservative because the population was mostly farmers and then industrialists. Auburn was an industrialist city. And then so my three agitators, all of whom ended up in Auburn, were really, really, really radical. I mean, their neighbors did not approve of them at all. However, the region had experienced the Second Great Awakening, especially in the 1820s and 1830s, when you may have heard of Charles Finney, who went across the state and organized these camp meetings, these revivalist meetings. And what he preached in those camp meetings was equality for women. Slavery is a sin, and it is your moral obligation to help put a stop to it, and temperance. And that was it for some reason, that region, it just became so caught up in this movement. And a lot of people joined either the Quakers or the Methodists or whatever, that it became known as the burned over district. So before my three women got involved, all of this stuff was beginning to churn.
Very interesting. I never knew any of that. So of the characters, I want to see if I can touch on the various characters as we go along here, but of the three, in some ways I find Martha Coffin Wright the most compelling. I mean, she's kind of the most ordinary one. She's, middle-class Quaker background, 6 kids, married, housekeeper. She's husband is a lawyer who doesn't really believe in equality for women. And I was drawn to her because she's a woman who, even though she got prominent later, she's trying to achieve these small steps toward equality. So I wanted to ask you, what did the world of women and women's rights look like to Martha Wright in, let's say, the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s?
So I loved Martha too, partly because she's incredibly witty and has this very sardonic sense. And one of my friends in Auburn referred to her as the woman who put the funny into feminism. So she, however, her older sister, you mentioned Lucretia Mott, her older sister, 14 years older than she was Lucretia Mott, who in the 1820s was a Quaker minister and an activist on human rights. She worked hand in hand with male abolitionists to pursue abolition and human rights more broadly speaking. So, and their mother had been, been one of the descendant of one of the family founders of Nantucket, very strong Quaker lineage. She had run her own shop. She believed completely in equality for women. So her children grew up believing that women were men's equal. It was just not an issue. And Martha began to bridle against all of the rules that had been put on women when she was bringing up her children. And she didn't really understand why she had to stay home with the children all day, every day, while her husband, who was a lawyer, went off and he traveled. He had this really interesting job. So but a lot of it, as you say, for a long time was kind of a private rebellion. And she was a rebel from birth. She just had this, she always was like breaking against the constraints. But she had this house full of dependent children. They were 6 young children, and she didn't have a house full of servants as her friend down the street, Frances Seward, did, who was a much wealthier woman. So she had to do all the cooking and cleaning and bathing of the children. And it was just nonstop from before dawn until midnight most nights. And she just got angrier and angrier. And so she and Frances became the two outliers in town. This was before Harriet Tubman entered the picture. And they started talking about women's rights and some of the things that Lucille Mott was preaching and abolition. And they decided that this was, a great, grave injustice. And then in 1848, Martha and her sister Lucretia went to visit several friends in Waterloo. And the women there, who included young Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had 2 young children of her own, started talking about this terrible state of affairs for women who had no legal rights at all. And they decided, well, let's hold a women's rights convention. And 10 days later, they did in Seneca Falls. So that was the moment when Martha suddenly came into her own, and the rest of her life changed completely.
You write in some great detail about, just to take one aspect of women's rights, property rights. Talk about what let's say someone like Martha in 1820 had as property rights, and also then that's a sort of a domino effect when you start to talk about property rights, what it leads to at the end if you start to give women property rights.
Yeah, if you start giving women property, then eventually they have the right to vote. And that was like a completely obscene idea at the time. So this was a big issue for women who realized once they got married, if they had any inheritance at all, it went right to their husband. And they had no right. So their husband literally owned them, and he could beat them. He could spend their money on drink, both of which Frances Seward's sister's husband did. And William Seward, Frances's husband, had to intervene. He took her money, spent it on drink, and he constantly beat up his wife. So this was, not only an abstraction, this was a living reality for these women. And at the same time, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was witnessing all of this in this little farming town of Seneca Falls where she lived. And children ran to her when their mothers were being beaten up by their fathers, and she would go over and like take the men by the scruff of the neck and tell them to stop it and behave themselves. So that was all feeding into what became, as you said, one of the 2 great social and political movements of the 19th century.
I wanted to ask about the Underground Railroad, because that's one of the focuses of your book to me is all about intersections of so many different things, intersections of the women, intersections with those 2 big movements, intersections ultimately with the war. But the Underground Railroad was one of the main ways that your characters interact. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to ask you to talk about how the Underground Railroad worked on a practical level in Auburn, New York, and how Harriet Tubman's, what do we call them, the people, the 70 people that she saved from the Eastern Shore of Maryland or whatever it is, fed through that or worked through that network.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions that I began the book with. How did the Underground Railroad work? And it was this, really, if you think about it, was this incredible experiment in democracy that lasted for 50 years with very few betrayals. And this was a very loose assemblage of free Black Americans, enslaved Americans, white ship captains, middle class and upper middle class women, like the 2 women in my book, on and on, people who believed in abolition. So each pocket of the country, all over, including the South, had a small number of abolitionists who were part of the Underground Railroad. And one of the slaveholders on the Eastern Shore, which is where Harriet Tubman was from, said, they saw slaves disappear, and they didn't understand that there was an underground railroad. And he said, this is a labyrinth that has no clue. And so because the secrets were so tightly held. So in 1849, when Harriet Tubman liberated herself, she walked from the Eastern Shore all the way to Philadelphia, which she had heard was a free city where, as a Black woman, she could get a job and she could support herself. And there were people who were working to overturn slavery. So she found her way there. One of the first people she got to know was Lucretia Mott, Martha's older sister. And my surmise, and that of other scholars, is that there's no paperwork to document this, but it's clear to me that Lucretia Mott introduced Harriet Tubman to her sister Martha in Auburn, and then Martha in Auburn introduced Harriet to Frances. And because Harriet needed all the contact, very trustworthy contacts she could get, and she had very few, especially when she was beginning across New York State. So here were two women in one town where she could find haven, she and her passengers. And Martha had been harboring enslaved people, fugitive slaves in her basement kitchen since the early 1840s. And then Frances lived in her father's house, so she had to wait until he died. But then she started harboring them in her basement kitchen. I think we actually have a slide, if Amanda wants to pull it up, of what the kitchen looks like today, because visitors to the Seward House Museum can see exactly what it looked like at the time.
So you write about there was this thing called the Fugitive Slave Act, which drove a lot of things, including, I think, Harriet Tubman's work. But I mean, there was one back from the 19th century, or for the 18th century rather, but there was another really strict one in 1850. Talk about what the Fugitive Slave Act was and what it meant for the Underground Railroad and Tubman's work.
That was sort of after the Second Great Awakening, that was the real catalyst in New York State and then throughout the North. So the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 legally made it, you legally had to, wherever you were, if you came across a fugitive slave or a suspected fugitive slave, you had to turn him over to the local, federal commissioner. And then a pro forma hearing was held. And then this person, who may well have been a freed person, many of them were caught up in this dragnet, would be immediately sent back into slavery. This absolutely enraged people across the North, including people who had not been political before, because they didn't believe that the federal government had any right to come into their territory and impose a law that they had abolished slavery many, many years ago. So there were even conservatives who were catalyzed by that. And Harriet Tubman, when she learned about the Fugitive Slave Act, she later told her first biographer, I decided I couldn't trust Uncle Sam with my people any longer. And I decided from that point on to take them clear off to Canada, which is what she did. And so Auburn, which is right in the middle of New York State, was directly on her route up into Canada.
So that's a really important connection. So Auburn, I asked you, we started this out saying, give me a geography lesson. Well, there's one right there. Is this a route that Harriet established from the Eastern Shore? I mean, from wherever, Maryland, which was a slave state, up through wherever it had to go, where Pennsylvania, and then up into New York, and then up into Canada? Was that how that gets?
Yes, and she was a genius in so many different ways. I mean, she couldn't read or write, but she had this phenomenal sense of direction. She had a sense of danger. She was gifted at making friends who could be trusted. So eventually, she had stops in Troy, New York, and in Syracuse, and Auburn, and Rochester, all cities and towns that had a presence, sometimes a very small presence, of abolitionists whom she could trust. And these were, there were long stretches of open fields in between, but she knew that there were these places where they could find food and shelter and sometimes money. And, from stop to stop, she would be told at one stop where her next stop would be, but eventually she got to know all of these people and she knew her way on her own.
And being chased all the way by bounty hunters, by these slave hunters. These were nasty pieces of work. I mean, these guys were, I mean, so what would happen if a slave hunter caught up with you in Auburn or Waterloo, New York? What happened? I mean, if you're an escaped slave.
You would be sent back immediately and, you know, viciously punished. Sometimes they would kill people on sight. It was really, really dangerous, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act passed, when all, you know, all of these regions, you know, in the South at least, beefed up their presence. So they kept trying to stop this exodus of slaves, and of course it only increased the people's determination to get out. And the amazing thing about Tubman, and she boasted about it late in life, she said, I can say what most conductors can never say, which is, I never lost a passenger. So she was followed very closely any number of times, but she protected all 70 of those people she got out, including just about every member of her family.
Well, if you all read Dorothy's book, you will see some of those narrations of the journeys are just they're gripping. They're adventure stories. They're extreme adventure stories with a great brave hero leading them. I wanted to turn to Frances Seward, a really interesting character, married to one of the most powerful politicians of his era, eventually the most prominent member of the Lincoln cabinet. But there's a moment that you described that really kind of caught me. This is the year is 1834, and Henry Seward has just run for governor of New York and lost. And I think it's for a health reason or something that he and his wife decide to go south to Virginia, I think for her health. And so they do. And so I think Henry has been south once before, but I don't think she had. And you described what it was like, I guess, to go from upstate New York, this kind of little area up there, into Virginia in 1834 and what they saw. If you could just talk about that for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. So the New York was the wealthiest state in the United States at the time, and it was, as I said, it was becoming heavily industrialized as the railroads were developed and so on. This was not happening in the South. And Frances and Henry noticed this immediately when they crossed in, especially when they crossed into Virginia. And suddenly the country seemed, 100 years behind, and they passed these large plantations and the sites of enslaved people working in the plantations. And one day they pulled up at a country inn, and they were in their carriage, and they heard the sounds of weeping and moaning. And pretty soon they saw a slave driver leading a group of probably 10-year-old little boys, all tied together by a rope. And he led them to a horse trough to drink, and then put them in a shed where they sobbed themselves to sleep, as Frances wrote in her journal from that trip. And she wrote, slavery, slavery, the evil effects were constantly before me. And that was her awakening. She'd already learned about women being brutalized up in the North, her sister among them. And she had been notionally very strongly against slavery, but it was the sight of slavery that really convinced her she had to commit her life to doing what she could to overturn the institution.
So you call these people agitators, and they were agitators. But Frances Seward's in a really interesting position for an agitator to be in. She's married to somebody who's a state senator, then from New York, a governor of New York, then a senator from New York, and then the Secretary of State of the United States, the single most powerful member of Lincoln's cabinet. So she's married to a profoundly powerful man. How do you agitate if you are, I don't know, the wife of somebody who's that, in those years, that powerful?
Yeah, Amanda, if you can show Stewart as Secretary of State, that might be fun for people to see. So she had a really hard time at this because he was extremely, today he would be called a real progressive. He believed in women's rights, very much so. However, when he was in Washington, and they had this very unusual arrangement where Frances lived in Auburn and only went down to Washington. That's him young, and then there's one of him later on when he's Secretary of State. This is after he was governor. But when she was in Washington, she was the wife of this very, very famous senator, and he expected her to behave herself. And so she was invited to sign a petition, an anti-slavery petition by the women of England. And he told her he did not think this would be a very good idea at all. And which inspired a letter to her sister saying, you know, I here Henry and I disagree. You know, if I had my own way, I would sign the letter. But I can't. I'm the wife of this politician. So she went to and he loved entertaining, and he had these huge parties. I mean, they were more popular than those of the White House. Yeah, there he is, the Secretary of State, looking more formidable. And he was a wonderful entertainer. And he really believed that you could bring together you know, what today would be called left-wing politicians and right-wing politicians, or Southerners and Northerners, and bring them together over a very generous dinner, and somehow they would, you know, all would be forgiven. And Frances was so perceptive, just brilliant. And she thought this was ridiculous. She knew this was never going to happen. She didn't trust Southerners at all. She knew that their minds were made up about slavery. And she hated playing the role of this genteel aristocrat who, you know, sort of floated through these rooms. And this, remember, Washington, and we have a picture of Washington at the time too, it was a slave, this was a southern city where slavery was legal. There were slave pens on the mall, and she saw coffles of slaves being herded off to auction, you know, almost every day when she was in Washington. So she found this completely abhorrent. And this was an ongoing series of tensions in their marriage. And it was later on, she really rose up and rebelled, and she told him she would not be his hostess anymore. She couldn't stand it. It was against everything she believed in. And she went back to Auburn, and that was the end of that phase of her life.
Well, to pick up on the idea of tension, so we fast forward a little bit here. So Lincoln is elected in 1860. And one of the first things that happens is that the abolitionists turn on him, because, of course, he's saying that publicly and very many times that he is not going to mess with slavery where it exists. He says he's not going to mess, correct me if I'm wrong, with the Fugitive Slave Act, at least not initially. And so you have abolitionists, Frances included, who, well, and Frederick Douglass being the most vocal of them, but who absolutely, they're furious. They're fit to be tied at Lincoln. And so now you have the Secretary of State of the Lincoln administration going along with this. We're going to kind of go easy on slavery and in the early going, married to this woman who's a very radical abolitionist. So I'm just picking up on what you said. What does that do to the marriage?
Yes, and by the way, it's worth saying that Martha was very close to Frederick Douglass. She invited him to her house all the time, and that created the scandal in Auburn. Frances read his newspaper, North Star, and she completely, you know, agreed with everything he was saying. She listened to his talks when he came through town. So this was the real blow up in their marriage. It's amazing that they stayed married throughout all of this. But so Seward, who had expected, by the way, to win the presidency in 1860, and Lincoln beat him in the Republican nomination. So in his parting speech in the Senate, Seward said, "In politics, it is not always possible to do what we believe is right." So Frances, back in Auburn, reads his speech, which was printed in the newspaper, and she was completely aghast. And she wrote him a letter saying, "Henry, how can you say this?" And he was totally in sync with Lincoln on this, because he was a politician, and he knew that slavery couldn't be abolished immediately. And their whole goal was to reinstate the Union, not to abolish slavery. And so Frances wrote this just excoriating letter saying compromises based on the idea that 4 million human beings should remain in slavery cannot be justified. And this is against everything you have said, you have spent your life, you know, opposing. So it was, and then he of course wrote back, and there was just this ongoing tension, and it continued really right until the end. Although, as we know, the Lincoln administration did come around eventually on emancipation, so it became a little bit easier after that.
Yeah, I think people forget that there was this early part that was not a honeymoon at all. I mean, yes, and whenever it is, he signs the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, but until then, it's rock and roll time with the abolitionists. They are not happy. It's just, there's so many interesting corners.
Oh, and I just have to add one more thing, which I find so interesting, and it's such an indication of Lincoln's facility as a politician, and also his ability and willingness to change. So after the war, or right after the war, he invited William Lloyd Garrison, another, this Bostonian flaming abolitionist. He invites him into the White House, and Garrison is very generous with him. But Lincoln says, you know what? I didn't do anything. It is this long moral war of the abolitionists that ended by disrupting slavery.
One of the things, so as I said, there's a lot of intersections here, and when we get to 1861, we have the kind of full-on intersection, which you're talking about now, between these agitators and the Civil War itself, which changes everything. I mean, it changes the premise of what Harriet Tubman's doing, because now, if you're going to free yourself, you're going to cross through Ben Butler's lines in Maryland, right? You don't have to be taken to Canada. Things change, and which she does something really radical about, but we'll get to that in a minute. But as you get to the war, the women's rights movement kind of takes a hit. Suddenly it's not the most important thing, or suddenly people may think that, the war is more important, or slavery itself, or emancipation is more important. And there's a great moment where David Wright, Martha's husband, says that, Susan B. Anthony's insane for pushing women's rights. Stop, you back off for a few years and we'll get back to it. But so talk about that, the impact of war, Civil War on the women's rights movement.
Yes, and at that point, by the way, Martha was, the fist, hand in glove with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the women's rights movement. So, and yet she totally agreed with her husband David that the war, she and Frances and Harriet Tubman all believed that this was a moral crusade. This was God's war, and that the nation in the North had to put everything into the war effort. And Susan B. Anthony didn't want to let it go. She wanted to, so they did the women's rights movement. They had annual conventions up until the war. And then even Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, we have to stop now because we have to help, get the war effort underway. And eventually the women turned, and Susan B. Anthony was furious and deeply upset, and it did set back the women's rights movement by a number of years. But the women got together and they helped launch a major petition drive for the 13th Amendment. And that's something else that's been sort of lost to history, but it was a big thing they did. They really got, the women they now had quite a large women's rights movement, and they sent all of their little deputies all across the North to go into their neighborhoods and get this petition signed to get the 13th Amendment, written into law, because the Emancipation Proclamation was not going to be a permanent fixture of American society.
That's really interesting. So wasn't there something like, weren't they going for 1 million? Was that?
Yeah.
Did they get their million? I can't remember.
They didn't. But they got a lot. I'm forgetting the actual number now. But all of the petitions were sent to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who by then lived in New York City. And she, there's this wonderful description of her. She rolled them all up by region. Wrote the numbers on it, put them in a massive trunk, and mailed it to Congress. They had gotten to know very well Charles Sumner, who was a big abolitionist and had many enemies in Congress for that and other reasons. He was very officious and he liked to do things his own way. And he wanted to lead the anti-slavery effort in Congress, and that was not really his job at all. So, and yet he said to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, send on the petitions, they give me opportunity to speak. And of course they did. So he gave a big speech in the Senate about how important this petition drive was, even if it had been organized by women, so it was a big deal. It helped get the 13th Amendment rolling.
Well, throughout your book are these intersections between these two movements, right? They keep crossing lines, and they keep the same people are doing the same things. And I don't think there was ever a better example of how the women's movement becomes the anti-slavery abolition movement as the 13th Amendment petition drive. I mean, that's where the one becomes the other fully. And then
Yes.
obviously they don't stop believing in women's rights. But there's also a time, you mentioned Sumner. So this is a great story. So Sumner is going to give this speech, right? And it's a nasty speech.
It's a really,
And it really is. I've read this speech and it is mean spirited, and he's going to crank all the demons out for this one. And so, and then he reads it to Frances, right?
and to Seward.
Yeah, and to Seward.
Because Frances happens to be there.
Okay, now you pick up the story from there.
Yeah, and it's not short, by the way. It's, a 3-hour speech, but they sit there and they listen to it, and they're a little horrified because he completely lets it rip against the Southerners and against Stephen A. Douglass, who is from Illinois and is sympathetic to slavery, and so he just calls out these guys by name, and he just in the most patronizing terms. So both Frances and Henry Seward say, and they're very good. Sumner is one of Frances's best friends because of course she believes in his politics completely. And she says, Charles, I think maybe it would be better if you tone down some of the language a little. And then Henry says, well, as usual, he asked for our advice and he went ahead and did exactly what he wanted to do. So one of the things I love are all these little human moments, and Sumner was so pompous. And this is one of the reasons people hated him so much in Congress, even people who sort of agreed with him. So he went ahead and he memorized this entire speech, and it was called The Crime Against Kansas. And this was when the Northeasterners were sending settlers, anti-slavery settlers to the territory of Kansas, and Southerners were sending, and Missourians were crossing over the border, sending pro-slavery. And so he was, and they had, essentially the beginning of the Civil War had begun in Kansas because these Missourians, Missouri was a slave state, where they were just like launching war against these free state settlers. So this is what this speech is all about. And he calls out one Representative, Preston Brooks by name, or his nephew. I can't remember. It isn't Preston Brooks, but the following day, it is Preston Brooks who, on behalf of his relative, goes into the Senate while Sumner is sitting at his little desk, franking the copies of his speech. And he has a cane with him, a gold-headed cane. And maybe we can show this slide too, this very famous scene when Preston Brooks, and Sumner, he doesn't have his glasses on, he can't stand up because the desk is nailed to the floor. The guy starts beating him to death with a cane on the Senate floor. And he finally is able to get up and he knocks him to the ground and he's beating him, he beats him into unconsciousness. And this is the caption here on the newspaper cartoon, Southern Chivalry, Argument versus Clubs. So, and there were frequently kind of attacks in people carried pistols into the Congress, but this was the worst, historically the worst that had ever been. And this was, kind of the beginning of bringing this, what had been a frontier debate, really right back east. And this was kind of going to be the lead up into what became the Civil War.
And this is, we should point out, this is 1856, but also he nearly killed Sumner. I mean, it was, yes, he beat him, but it was really a beating. I mean, it was shocking that Sumner didn't die. But again, it's part of it's a story that when you read this book, you're going to read this story, and there's Frances, one of your agitators, right in the middle of one of the most famous Civil War stories and dramatic of the age, of any age. It's the Preston Brooks nearly killing Sumner on the Senate floor. It doesn't get any more dramatic.
Her dear friend. And this is why I found it completely fascinating to write a book about women who were ostensibly powerless. And she was, effectively powerless. But here she is, right with the second most famous politician of the 19th century. And Seward went right to see Brooks after he was beaten, and he was just very, still covered with blood on the bed in his boarding house. And he wouldn't let Frances go with him because he knew it would be such a it would be so dismaying. And she wrote back home to a friend that, this winter, the furor in my heart, will now never rest, essentially. And once again, she kind of ratcheted up her activities against slavery.
I wanted to ask, we have a few more minutes here for taking some just questions. Just one more item that, to close out. So Harriet Tubman is no longer needed to do the specific thing that she did before because of the dynamics of the Union military in the Civil War. But she does something in some ways even more extraordinary. She heads south. There's been this fighting relatively early in the war in these sea islands of South Carolina, and which has resulted in the kind of a Union victory. And this kind of displacement of 10,000 slaves. And suddenly now Harriet Tubman turns her attentions to this area. And this is what the war does to her. So what happened there?
Yeah, again, this is just this was my favorite chapter. I just thought this is incredible that this woman who was, not long out of slavery herself, by then she had gotten to know basically all of the major abolitionists in Boston. One man she hadn't met was the governor, and he was an abolitionist. And one of her good friends in Boston got her in to see the governor of Massachusetts, and he gave her permission to go behind, go behind. You weren't allowed into military territory unless you had permission. And she convinced him that given her 10 years of experience on the Underground Railroad, she would have a lot to offer to the soldiers down there and the commanders. So she got herself down to Port Royal, South Carolina. She helped in this public-private experiment called the Port Royal experiment, where basically designed to help the formerly enslaved people learn how to make a living on their own. She did a lot there, but really what she had told Martha she would be doing, which was Secret Service. She got to know all of the officials down there, and she got permission. She got money from them and permission to organize a band of scouts. And she made it her business to report back. So the scouts would go out into the outlying area, still controlled by the Confederates. They would bring back information to her, and then she would report to the generals. And just as you talked earlier about how interconnected everything is, the country was so small at that point, and because we're talking to a largely Boston audience, and we can show. I think I have a photograph of Thomas Wentworth Higginson, whom Harriet had gotten to know extremely well before the war, when she was speaking publicly in Boston. He adored her. She became basically a second member of his family. During the war, he ended up in Port Royal, as did Harriet Tubman. She heard that he had come. He was promoted to a colonel, and he led the 1st Regiment of Black soldiers of the Civil War. Harriet immediately went to see him. As family lore had it, she brought with her a brace of ducks from the Combahee River. And so we have an account of her going in, because he writes home to his wife about it. Oh, Harriet Tubman stopped by today. You never know who you're going to meet down here. And Harriet, of course, was, completely committed to the idea of Black soldiers. And she wanted to be a Black soldier too. She couldn't because she was a woman, but she helped lead one of the most famous raids of the Civil War, which was the Combahee River raid. And she was invited to go along on these 3 warships that went up the river, and they stopped at several plantations, and they burned the plantations, and they liberated 750 slaves. So Harriet had dictated a letter to a friend in Port Royal, had it sent up to one of her friends in Boston who ran an abolitionist newspaper.
Well, it's she was also turned out to be a better scout than the scouts, right? I mean, she was like the scout. Yeah,
she was a lead. She was one of the great leaders of all time. Really, just astonishing.
Okay, we've got some questions here from the audience. I would remind everybody out there in library land that you can type in a question if you like to in the chat box, and we'll be happy to pass it along. So here's a question. So what started you on this journey? What did you know of the story as a child or from school, or how did it start?
Well, I mentioned at the beginning that my grandmother grew up in Auburn. And so that the first book I wrote was based on her letters from an adventure she had. And that you can read about that on my website. But the one thing that was part of our family lore, and her best friend, who lived right across from the Sewards, was that when they were 4 or 5, she and her best friend were standing on South Street, which is where Frances Seward had sold a house to Harriet Tubman in 1859 before the war. And that's another whole amazing story, and where the Seward house is. So after the war, Harriet Tubman went back and lived in the house that Frances Seward had sold her. So my grandmother, and this just stuck with me, when she was 4 years old, and Harriet Tubman, who lived a very long life until 1913, went past. Of course, everyone in Auburn recognized Harriet Tubman, and they remembered seeing her. They thought she had been riding a bicycle. That's ridiculous. She was, as one of Harriet Tubman's great grandnieces who lives in Auburn said, no, she was probably driving, a horse-drawn cart. But Harriet knew everybody in town, and so somehow the idea that my grandmother's life had intersected with Harriet Tubman's, I thought was kind of phenomenal. And I also wondered, how did Harriet Tubman end up in Auburn, New York? So that was part of my quest.
Another question is, this applies to, I guess, directly to Martha's family, but so why are the Quakers so deeply involved in the social justice issues of the 19th century?
The Quakers believed in that everyone had an inner light. And they believed that it basically was God speaking to them. And so from that sprang this belief that slavery was a deeply moral sin, the biggest sin of all. And I must say that not all Quakers from the beginning were anti-slavery. In Philadelphia in the 1700s, some continued to own slaves themselves, but the Quaker meeting in Philadelphia quickly put a stop to that. And after that, and there were more conservative Quakers, and Martha and Lucretia were Hicksite Quakers who were very radical. And so that faction of Quakers, just fought for human rights, broadly conceived, specifically and most importantly in their view, to overturn slavery.
If I recall correctly from your book, wasn't Martha kicked out of the church as a young woman?
She was.
How did that happen?
She got married at age 18 to a non-Quaker and a military man. And as you know, Quakers are pacifists. And so she had committed 2 cardinal sins. And so the head of the Quaker church, the Quaker meeting she was part of, wrote her a letter. She had gone down with her new husband to Florida, which is where he was based. And they said, you are no longer a Quaker. And she wrote back at age 18 or 19, she wrote back and she said, I don't care what you say. I will pursue Quakerism as I believe in it. And that was very, very much Martha's sensibility.
So did she persist? And was Lucretia, Lucretia Wright?
Lucretia stayed in the meeting that she belonged to in Philadelphia. Absolutely. But Martha didn't take her children to church, which horrified their neighbors. She did, and she didn't. She said, I'm not going to read, the Bible all day to my children if I don't feel like it. I'm going to teach them religion as I live it. And that's really what she believed. And she brought all of her children up to become reformers themselves.
So what was the word you used for the radical Quakers, the Hicksite? What were they?
Hicksites.
How do you spell that? Hicksites.
Hicksit. They were Hicksites.
This new one.
Followers of a man named Hicks who started in England.
Who were the waymakers, role models, writers, speakers who inspired this group to take action?
Well, we can show one of them. William Lloyd Garrison he had started his anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, I think in the early 1830s. And he had a huge influence on Martha. Lucretia Mott was a very good friend of his. In fact, he credited Lucretia with helping him become a better speaker. The first time she heard him speak, he was reading from his notes, and she said, "William, thee must put aside thy paper and speak from the heart and soul." Anyway, he credited Lucretia Mott and her husband James with really helping him to find himself and to really, pursue his life goal of overturning slavery. And he was one of the ones who really helped do it. And Frederick Douglass, of course, was another, phenomenal figure in this movement.
So here's a question from Steve. Do you think Tubman in her fundraising speeches before white audiences crafted her speeches to suit their preconceptions? Was she more acceptable as a storytelling grandmother type rather than a Bible quoting powerful woman talking about slavery and inequality?
She absolutely, in my view, she absolutely suited her talks to her audiences. So when she talked to women, she often spoke about how she had gone on her first trip back to the Eastern Shore. She had gone down to get her husband, her freeborn husband, thinking that he would come back with her and they could finally start a family in Philadelphia. He had taken another wife. It had been 2 years. She'd been gone for 2 years. She was completely crushed, but she told a friend up north, I just took him out of my heart. And that was what convinced her to become this amazing conductor on the Underground Railroad. So she knew that Boston, this was mostly in Boston, these Boston women, many of them didn't have the greatest marriages, and yet none of them would have the courage to leave their husbands. But it was a great fundraising thing to do. And they loved the way she told stories, and she was a wonderful storyteller. And so some people say, oh, maybe she demeaned herself a little bit by, the way she played roles and everything. I don't see it that way. I see her as, being in her own way as savvy at fundraising as her friend John Brown was in his very different way.
Here's a question from Mary Lou. I'm interested in how you saw the relationship among the three women. How strong or close were their friendships in constructing your book? How much did you want to focus on their connections versus their separate activities and contributions? That's sort of a complex.
These are great questions. It was much easier to tell the lives of Frances and Martha than it was to tell the life of Harriet Tubman, because she didn't leave a paper record. And the letters of Frances and Martha, there are so many of them, and they tell their stories themselves. However, Martha, who couldn't keep a secret, she often wrote about Harriet Tubman and her relationship with her in her letters, so I found out a great deal there. Frances did not. She was extremely discreet, and she thought she would be putting Harriet in danger. But I could tell by putting all of the records that have been collected over the years by Tubman academic biographers and others, I could see I certainly could see what this relationship with this phenomenal Black woman who had liberated herself and walked alone into freedom, what she meant, and how much Frances Seward and Martha Wright admired her. She was the embodiment of everything they believed about abolition. And the friendship with Harriet Tubman lasted through several generations of both families. And so their descendants wrote about Tubman. And she was a very, very close friend. She believed that she treated their children as she would have treated children of her own. She never had her own children. She adored the children of all of her friends. So gradually I tried to create a portrait of Harriet Tubman that I thought was true to the person she wanted to be remembered as. And she did leave this very consistent oral record, which I consider her oral history, which was the way she spoke in public and the way she talked to her friends about very important chapters of her life.
That's one person in history I would really like to have heard.
Oh, I know.
Happened. But okay, we have time for one more question. This is from from Alicia. Hi, Dorothy from South Korea.
Wow.
Great presentation. The Boston Library has a giant reach. Hi, Dorothy from South Korea. Great presentation. You briefly mentioned a scandal between Frederick Douglass and I believe Martha. Can you please tell us more about that?
Oh yeah, well this is actually one of my favorite stories. Martha believed that in order to force people to change their backward thinking, you had to show them what the right way of thinking and living your life was. So at Seneca Falls, Frederick Douglass attended Seneca Falls. He was a big supporter of women's rights. She not only got to know and became close friends to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she became very close to Frederick Douglass. So whenever he came through Auburn, she invited him to dinner or to spend the night. And this was a scandal in Auburn. This was social equality, and it was absolutely, I mean, hotels didn't allow Black people to stay in them. This was just not done. And she thought it absolutely was to be done. And so she wrote to one of her children that she was at I think it was a bridal party in Auburn. And she was just, kind of standing near two other women who were talking in stage whispers. And one said to the other, "Who is that handsome woman?" And the other woman said to her, "That is Mrs. David Wright. She's a very dangerous woman." So it's kind of that era's equivalent of nasty woman, a woman who dared to speak her own mind and live the way she wanted to.
Well, Dorothy, thank you. Look, it's as much fun listening to you as it is reading you. So for those of you who haven't read the book, please go do so. And thank you. It's been a great conversation. And I'm going to hand you and the whole thing back to Beth.
Thanks so much, Sam. It's great seeing you.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dorothy. And thank you, Sam. I know we all learned a lot tonight, and I'm sure that everyone who doesn't yet have a copy of the book will want to go get at least one copy. And I believe we have a slide that to remind you all where you can buy the book through Trident Booksellers here in Boston. And there's some clues at the bottom of it about getting a discount on shipping. So these will be signed copies of the book, and I hope you'll all feel free to order some. So I am going to be speaking briefly on behalf of our colleague, Margaret Talcott, about American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society before I talk about the State Library. So as always, we've been delighted to collaborate with this organization on the talk tonight. So if you're again, this is about American Ancestors now. If you're researching your own family history, please consider using the resources of their library and Brew Family Learning Center. Stacks on Newbury Street in Boston are now open, or you can visit their digital archives anytime. You can also connect with one of their genealogists 9 to 5, Tuesday through Saturday, or join in an educational program, all of this online through americanancestors.org. under the Education tab. It's a wonderful organization. And now about some upcoming events for them. On August 5th in the afternoon, they'll be joined by UK author Sean Evans and broadcast journalist Robin Young, host of the NPR WBUR program Here and Now. After an illustrated presentation, the two will discuss Sean's new book, Maiden Voyages, Magnificent Ocean Liners and the Women Who Traveled and Worked Aboard Them. So Sean was prompted by her own family history to undertake this work. A relative of hers worked on the Cunard Line. So this book is just perfect for family history lovers. Beyond that, who doesn't like ocean going with Marlena Dietrich, Wallace Simpson, and Josephine Baker, alongside all the so-called working girls in second class, ocean liner staff, and immigrants from Eastern Europe down below. So please join American Ancestors for this experience on the high seas. Should be a fun afternoon, and our colleague Margaret expects to be here for that American Inspiration event. And then I'll describe in just a minute the August 17th event that American Ancestors will be holding in collaboration with the State Library. So at American Ancestors, coming up on September 2nd, again with the Boston Public Library and Porter Square books, they'll welcome Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar with their new book, Still Mad, American Women Writers and Feminist Imagination. It's 40 years after their first groundbreaking work of feminist literary theory, The Mad Woman in the Attic. And they're now going to, in this new book, they map the literary history of feminism's second wave. And it's been described as a brilliant, sweeping history of the contemporary women's movement told through the lives and works of the literary women who shaped it. So again, American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society sincerely hopes you can join them again for these events. So now I'm going to switch to my state library voice for some remarks about the State Library of Massachusetts. So I hope both of our speakers tonight, and I hope all of our attendees tonight, will feel welcome to visit us in the Massachusetts State House after we reopen. In the meantime, we invite all of our viewers today to start with our website to learn about our resources, our services, and our great collections. You can type in a simple version of our URL, mass.gov/lib, that will take you right to our homepage. And you'll see on this brief introductory slide that our collections cover a wide variety of formats and topics. The most of our holdings document Massachusetts history and government. We have a large amount of material relating to the Commonwealth, and much of it is available in our digital repository, all of which you can find on our website. You're welcome to contact us for help with your research questions, and we'll do our best while we can from working from home. And then, of course, once we return, we'll be glad to provide even more expert in-person help, again, once we reopen. So we have links in the chat for all of these resources. So we also have some upcoming events that cover very different aspects of Massachusetts history than what we heard about tonight. So next month on Tuesday, August 17th, in collaboration with our colleagues at American Ancestors, we will host Scott Borchert on his new book, Republic of Detours, How the New Deal Paid Broke Writers to Rediscover America. And the publisher describes his work as an immersive account of the New Deal project that created state-by-state guidebooks to America in the midst of the Great Depression and employed some of the biggest names in American letters. Then on Tuesday, so just 1 week later, on Tuesday, August 24th, in collaboration with the Boston Public Library, we'll hear from Dr. Adam Stern on his new book, Committed, Dispatches from a Psychiatrist in Training, which has a very local flavor since he concentrates on his residency program at Harvard. And my colleague Kristen will also mention this. So I hope you'll be able to join us for both of these presentations. Thank you. Now back to Kristen for our final announcements.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you very much, Dorothy and Sam, for that incredible conversation. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you for those of you who did ask questions. It just enriched the entire program. So we will be sharing the copy of this program. If you would like to see it, it will appear on our website shortly, so you can look for it on any of our websites. And at the Boston Public Library, if you'd like to find resources, services, and programs free to all and for all ages, visit us at bpl.org. And we also have a couple of author programs coming up that we wanted to share here briefly. On August 19th, we have E.L. Press. He's a journalist. He'll be in conversation with Kim Phillips-Fine about Press's new book, Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America. And that's in partnership with the BPL's Kirstein Business Library. And you can find information about that in the chat. And then as Beth mentioned, on August 24th, we have Dr. Adam Stern with his new book, Committed, Dispatches from a Psychiatrist in Training. And that'll be a local author talk, and we hope you will join us for that. And we already heard about the program on September 2nd, Mad Women with Gubar and Gilbert. And information on all of these are available in the chat, and you can sign up on our websites. So thank you to our partners, thank you to you, and thank you to our behind the scenes team for making tonight's conversation possible. We hope to see you again at one of our events or in person. Take care and good night.